Mrs. Robinson, and the streets of Philadelphia, and most particularly the parking around here with the flower show. It's a real challenge, and we certainly appreciate you all making the time and the effort to be with us today. I'm John Walsh, Chairman of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. Before we begin, please take a moment to silence your cell phones and electronic devices. Having said that, however, we're happy to have you tweet about today's program and what you hear this afternoon from Mrs. Robinson. And we always encourage you to like the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia on Facebook. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to brief you on a few upcoming events for the Council. We hope you'll be able to join us April 9th, where we'll pay tribute to former Council President Claudia McBride at a special event featuring Chris Matthews, host of MSNBC's Hardball. Additionally, we're happy to announce the new Stan and Arlene Ginsberg Family Foundation Great Debate Series. And we're very pleased to have Stan with us this afternoon. And the first conference of that new series is scheduled to take place this spring, and keep an eye out for upcoming announcements to what we think will prove to be a really dynamic series of events and debates around critical issues for the country and for the globe. In addition to these and other programs, we have a number of exciting travel opportunities, including our upcoming 5-night Inside Washington program this April, where some 20 participants will have a chance to engage with speakers including Ambassador Mark Grossman, Ambassador J. Stapleton Roy, and Ambassador Francois Delatte in our nation's capital, gain access to the exclusive Cosmos Club, engage with keynote speakers at the National Press Club, and visit Mount Vernon, among other activities. Please be sure to pick up travel brochures, which I'm sure you all saw in the lobby, for more information about this trip and the many other trips that the Council organizes. Our events and tours, along with the generous support of our members and partners, enable the Council to continue its most important mission of offering meaningful education programs that help to prepare a diverse group of over 2,100 middle and high school students in 80 schools throughout the greater Philadelphia area for their future role as global citizens. We're delighted to have a number of student groups with us this afternoon from the Masterman School, Hart High School, my wife's alma mater, the Shipley School, Friends Central School, Girard College, and our partner school, the Bodine High School for International Affairs, here with us today. We're particularly grateful to the Doran Family Foundation for their support of today's program. Bill Doran of the Doran Family Foundation has not only been an avid supporter of the Council and all of our efforts, but he also is a very valued board member of the Council. Now, I'd like to invite Craig Snyder, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia, up to the podium to introduce our speaker. Craig.
Thank you, everyone. As some of you were in the room to hear me say a few minutes ago, but not most of you, we are starting and running today's program a little bit behind our original schedule because that just completely incompetent city to the north of us, Boston, was somehow unable to have their airport properly operating today. But Mrs. Robinson very graciously stuck with the commitment to come to us, and a 45-minute trip turned into a multi-hour difficulty. But we're delighted that she's here now and that we can go forward. We will end this program somewhere around 1:45, and again, Mrs. Robinson has been gracious enough to say that she'll stay for a brief time after that to mingle with you as would have happened in the reception prior had we gone according to the original plan. I am most delighted to welcome our guest of honor to the Council's podium today. Before being elected President of Ireland in 1990, Mrs. Robinson concurrently served for 20 years as a barrister, a member of the Trinity College Law Faculty, and a member of the Irish Senate. Elected Ireland's first female president, Mrs. Robinson continued to break taboos during her 7 years in office, becoming the first Irish head of state to make official visits to Britain and regularly to visit Northern Ireland. She was the first head of state to visit Somalia after the crisis in 1992 and Rwanda just after the 1994 genocide, bringing global media attention to the suffering of the Rwandan people. Following her tenure as president, Mrs. Robinson served from 1997 until 2002 as the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and really breathed life into that job, working to integrate human rights as part of the agenda of all the activities of the United Nations. She then went on to found and serve as president of Realizing Rights, the Ethical Globalization Initiative, whose mission from 2002 until 2010 was to put human rights standards at the heart of global governance and policymaking. She is also the recipient of numerous honors, including Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Obama and the Indira Gandhi and Sydney Peace Prizes. She currently heads the Mary Robinson Foundation, Climate Justice. In addition, she is a member of the Elders, an independent group of global leaders brought together by Nelson Mandela in 2007, and a founding member of the Council of Women World Leaders. And if that were not enough to keep her busy, last September, she published her memoir, Everybody Matters, My Life Giving Voice. We could not feel more privileged that she has taken time from this rich schedule and indeed fought the elements to be with us here today. As many of you know, today is also International Women's Day. We certainly live in a time of unparalleled achievement and progress for women in this country and around the world, with the life and career of our guest today as wonderfully emblematic of that good news. I've been talking all week to my 8-year-old daughter about Mrs. Robinson and her distinguished life, and I can only hope that my daughter and all the daughters of the world, in whatever manner they may choose, can follow in the footsteps of Mrs. Robinson in leadership in world affairs. Having said that, we should also pause on International Women's Day to remember that today, at this very moment, there are countless women around the world still treated essentially as property. Places in the world where it is considered appropriate, even necessary, for a woman to be jailed or even killed because she has been the victim of rape. So, as on most subjects, the glass on International Women's Day is both half full and half empty. I'm delighted that we have Mrs. Robinson here that we can turn to help us understand from her point of view how we can fill that glass the rest of the way. Please join me now in welcoming Mary Robinson.
I'm delighted to be here. Oof, it didn't look too like it. As we sat for about 2.5 hours on that plane in Boston, and were told very little, and then suddenly we were able to move towards de-icing. And I have to be fair to Boston, actually it was snowing very heavily, so there was a lot to worry about. But I'm particularly pleased to be back in Philadelphia. It's a city that I have a great affection for. I've been coming here over the years. You have incredible culture and arts here, but you also have a great caring for those who are less privileged or have fallen on difficult times, or are new immigrants. I know the great work of the Irish with immigrants that then expanded to all the other nationalities, all the other minorities, and I thought that was a great move, and I was very proud of it on visits to Philadelphia. So I'm very pleased to speak, and I do encourage everybody to eat, because I had great training when I was High Commissioner for Human Rights. I used to be invited to these working dinners or working lunches of ambassadors, and they all got to eat, and I had to talk. So I'm very used to it. Don't worry, don't feel impolite. Please eat away as those of you who are eating, the rest of you, since there are a lot of young people here, I'm particularly glad to see that I can also draw on my own experience and share it. Because that was the idea of the book, Everybody Matters. I wanted to write a memoir that hopefully would be readable. And those of you who have got a copy will see that I did it with Tessa Robinson, who's our daughter. And Tessa's actually coming here this evening. She's coming from Dublin and she would be here for the event of the American Philosophical Society. She couldn't come earlier because she has 2 young children, 2 of our precious 4 grandchildren, and she could only bargain to be away for the weekend, and that seemed fair enough. But she helped me. Of course, Nick, my husband, who's sitting at this table, always had his red pencil and his views, and he's responsible for at least one of the cartoons in the book. But what was the story that I really wanted to convey? I think it was very much one to encourage, because how could I have known, growing up in the west of Ireland, in a non-political family, both my parents were doctors, and I was the only girl wedged between 4 brothers. Now that was definitely where I learned about human rights and equality, and I'm glad that I'm speaking on International Women's Day, and indeed I think that subject was very well introduced. We must celebrate International Women's Day, but we must also remember that there are many struggles still for many girls and women around the world, and I might come back to that briefly at the end. But I was encouraged by both parents to believe that I had as much potential, as much possibility of doing things as my 4 brothers. But that wasn't the surrounds in Ireland at that time. At that time, girls and women knew their place. And they were really either headed for marriage or to become a nun. Unless you were very talented and could write or sing or something, and then maybe you could do something. And I was influenced by some very influential nuns in my family, particularly a sister of my father's, who had spent a long number of years in India, used to write these long letters about the work she was doing with poor children in India. And this seemed to be very worth doing. So in my last year in boarding school with the Sacred Heart nuns in Dublin, I decided I certainly didn't want to get married, and that was the talk among my contemporaries. You know, what will we do for a year or 2 before we get married? That's the automatic, and I thought, no, that's not for me. So I was brought up as a strict Catholic, and I decided that I would offer myself as a nun. So I went to the Reverend Mother, and she kind of looked at me fairly shrewdly, and she said, well, look, Mary, I think you should go away for a year and think about it, and if you still want to come back and enter the convent, we'd be delighted. And my parents were pleased. They were pleased and honoured that I was going to become a nun, but also very pleased that they had me for another year. So they very kindly sent me to Paris for a year, and that changed things. And in fact, in essence, I think what happened was, when I landed at the age of just 17 in Paris, first of all I discovered, and this I'm sure will amuse some of the young people, that I had got honours French in my leaving certificate. And I didn't understand a word anybody was saying, because I had learned from books. I'd never had the advantage that those learning languages now have, of hearing the written word and speaking, and learning a language as a spoken language. So that was confusing. But I also found that the atmosphere in Paris at the time encouraged me to think. I read the philosophers. We had very good teachers in the finishing school that I was at. I went to the art galleries, got a very good sense of the culture, but also began to think about all the things I wasn't encouraged to think about in Ireland. That why is it that girls have such limited possibilities, can't be altar boys, can't be priests? What is it about the rather patriarchal role of the church? So, in brief, I decided that there was no higher moral standard than the teaching of Jesus Christ, but I had not criticisms of some of the aspects of the church. And that was difficult, and I tell this in the book. When I came back from Paris, my father came and spent a week with me at the end, and I didn't tell him that I had developed a lot in my thinking. But when I came back, my parents were very distressed. It was very hard to talk about it, because again, these were not issues that were easily talked about in Ireland at the time. And I stayed at home for a year, and then came to Trinity College to study law. I had a grandfather who was a great friend when I was growing up, because he was a retired lawyer in the west of Ireland, and he talked to me about law as being about justice, an instrument for social justice. And so I decided that I would study law, and I followed my 2 brothers to Trinity College, who were already studying medicine, and my 2 other brothers followed me, and the 5 of us were there together, 3 doing law and 2 doing medicine. We had a house which my mother had acquired very shrewdly, and we let the bottom part of it, and then we as students were in the top part. And it was the house where Oscar Wilde was born, and there was a plaque on the door, or just beside the door. that gave us a sense, though it did become known to other students as Wild House while the 5 of us were there. But the Wild House was mainly my brothers, and I was more studious. And though I did have some fun as well. When I finished my law in Trinity, I was lucky enough to get a fellowship to Harvard University to do a master's in law. And I was very lucky in the year. I know for a lot of young people listening, I am extremely old, and I admit it. I'm the class of 98. So I really am an elder. But what a year that was, 1967 to 68. When I arrived in Boston and came to Cambridge and started talking and listening to students, they were questioning an immoral war, as they saw it. And many of my contemporaries were interested in civil rights issues in the south of this country, poverty programs in the south of this country and elsewhere. It was a very inspirational time. And also, it was quite interesting for me that young people actually felt they could change things and do things. So when I went back to Ireland, I went back as a young woman who was imbued with the Harvard spirit. But of course, Nick, who had been a student with me and had become a political cartoonist, said that I was imbued with Harvard humility, you know. But anyway, whatever it was, the year after I went back, I was practicing at the Irish Bar and had begun teaching law. And I noted that there was about to be a parliamentary election and that there were university seats in the Senate, but they were always elderly male professors. And so I questioned that. Why? And the answer was that if you want to run for the Senate, we'd all, you know, gang up and see if we can support you. So at the age of 25, I was elected to the Irish Senate. And that was an incredible privilege and opportunity to participate in something that I felt very strongly about. I'd given a talk about it as auditor of the Law Society in Trinity, the whole area of law and morality in Ireland. I felt that there was too much tendency to equate sin and criminality, and that there are things that might not be approved of, but they shouldn't be criminalized. And so the first measure that I decided to introduce into the Senate was simple law to mend the law and family planning in Ireland. And to me it was kind of logical. I had all this Harvard Law School logic, and it was seemed as though, you know, in Shakespeare's terms, the law of the time was an ass, because married women could not avail of the contraceptive pill unless a doctor prescribed that they had cycle regulation problems. And we used to joke that it must have been the Irish weather. But an awful lot of women had cycle regulation problems. And also, it wasn't against the law to use a condom, but it was against the criminal law to buy or sell a condom. So this seemed to be something to address in a short bill to amend an earlier provision of criminal law. And 2 male senators joined with me, and we tabled it. And of course I completely underestimated the shock, the dismay, the hate letters, and being denounced from pulpits. And of course that caused my parents great dismay because they were very devout Catholics. And the Catholic Archbishop at the time, Archbishop McQuaid, required a letter to be read out in every diocese in Dublin that said that such a measure, and I remember the words, would be and would remain a curse upon the country. And the following morning the Irish press had a very big headline, "Curse upon the country." And I was 26, and that was not easy. And it was a difficult time. I did feel that stress. I wobbled. I was afraid going down the main street in Dublin, Grafton Street, that somebody would jump out and say, "I hate you, you're the devil." And yet I felt this was very important to do. We had to bring our law into conformity, and especially for women, with the reality of the time. And so Nick destroyed some of the letters because we just got married at that point. And that in a way we both regret, because they were actually a story of the time. You know, we were quite archival people, but it shows the pressure of that time. We persisted with my 2 male colleagues. That particular bill never even got published by Parliament. I think it's the only measure that was put forward as a parliamentary initiative that was never published. But of course the text of it was in every newspaper, everybody knew what was there, just to show that kind of mood. The next time we tried, we made it a health family planning bill. We moved from criminal law to health. And then about 9 years later, the government of the day brought in that measure. Meanwhile, I was lucky enough to take a number of different cases in the Irish courts. And I was particularly interested in cases that would affect a whole range of people, not just the individual client. And so I took cases in the Irish High Court and Supreme Court in particular. But also, Ireland benefited from the Convention on fundamental rights and freedoms, and that was in Strasbourg, the Human Rights Court in Strasbourg, and also our membership of the European Union, which had a court which requires countries to comply with the directives of the European Union, including directives on equal pay and equal opportunity. So I had a nice opportunity to take cases to Strasbourg on human rights issues, some of them relating to women. We challenged the law on homosexuality successfully. We challenged the way in which children whose parents couldn't marry because one of them had been married before and there was no divorce in Ireland, but the children were illegitimate. We successfully challenged that. And we challenged a lot of equality legislation in the court in Luxembourg. And I really enjoyed that. So much so that after 20 years in the Irish Senate, in 1989, I decided, you know, I'm now a member of the English bar as well as the Irish bar. Nick and myself have a Centre for European Law in Trinity, and we have 3 children. And it's time to retire from the Irish Senate. And I quite honestly thought that was the end of my political life. I was now going to be a lawyer, and, you know, my family life would be increasingly private and significant. And then on Valentine's Day in 1990, I got a request to meet a friend of mine who had been a former Attorney General for the Labour Party when the Labour Party was in coalition with Gareth Fitzgerald's Fine Gael party. And I had been briefly a member of the Labour Party and still had friends in the Labour Party, but I thought my friend John Rogers was coming to tell me he had a family problem or something. So he came to my home, went into the dining room, and he asked me would I consider accepting a nomination from the Labour Party to run for president. And my jaw dropped, and I looked at him, and in my thought process immediately I said, no, the presidency is outside, you know, the mainstream of Irish life. It's a very important office, but it's not really a very active one. So I didn't want to say no, because it was an honour to be invited. So I said, look, John, it really is an honour to have been invited. Let me think about it. And then I rang Nick, and I said, you won't believe this. And Nick said, it's Valentine's Day, come to lunch. And so I came to lunch, and he basically said to me, you know, you're a constitutional expert. Have you ever looked closely at the provisions of the Constitution about the presidency as a chapter? And I said, well, to be perfectly honest, I haven't. And because he said that, I looked at it, and I thought, this office could do so much more. Why is it not much more active and proactive? So I ultimately accepted the nomination if I could run as an independent, because I had resigned a few years earlier from the Labour Party and had been re-elected as an independent senator. And the presidency in Ireland is a non-executive presidency. It's sort of outside the political stream. It's the Taoiseach and the government under our parliamentary system who have the political power. But the presidency up to then had been a very high position, the highest office in the land, head of state of the country. Usually when the president visited, there would be a band and red carpet, and it was a very big occasion around the country. And the president represented Ireland abroad, received the credentials of ambassadors, and had some constitutional powers which were important, of being able to refer bills to the Irish Supreme Court and so on. But I could see that somebody directly elected by the people of Ireland had a different kind of mandate, a mandate to represent locally and regionally in every way other than in the strictly political. So when I was nominated, I knew exactly what my chances were, because the Irish bookmakers tell you that. And they told me that I had a 100 to 1 chance of being elected. And then we had a roller coaster campaign, and we got lots of support, and I got out earlier than the favoured candidate, who was the then Deputy Prime Minister Taoiseach, Brian Lenihan, a very likeable, popular man. And Fine Gael were also going to put up a candidate, Austin Kerry, who was also English. But I got out to local radio and local newspapers and to audiences around the country talking about the possibility of a much more proactive president. And people began to like it. So by the time the other 2 men were nominated, they began to speak in the same way, but they weren't as honed as I was. Anybody who's run for election knows that during an election campaign, you start by not being quite sure what you want to say, but by the end, you really know what it is you want to say. And I want to be a president with a purpose of broadening the presidency within the Constitution. And somehow that was sufficiently compelling that I was elected. It was a huge honour. I speak in the book about the day of the inauguration when, well, first of all, maybe just when the night I was elected, I thanked the women of Ireland in particular, because I knew that so many women had decided to vote differently from their husbands or their fathers or whatever, and just go out and give a vote to change things in Ireland, because there was no doubt that somebody with my background getting elected as president signified a much more open and pluralist Ireland. And in the excitement of that acceptance speech, I said that I would put a light in the window of the official residence, which only has an Irish name. So the name is Áras, which means house, on Uachtaráin, which is the president, Áras on Uachtaráin, that's what it's called. And I said I'd put a light in Áras on Uachtaráin for all of those who'd had to emigrate from Ireland, as a symbol of connection, a symbol that we care, that we want to be in touch. And I totally underestimated that light. I can't tell you what a powerful symbol that was, 24/7 for the 7 years. You could see it from the Phoenix Park, and it was in the kitchen of our home. And many people came, I mean, from this country, members of Congress. Tip O'Neill, I particularly remember. I had known him coming as an Irish senator. I'd met him, and he asked to come and see me when he was visiting Ireland, came in, and then we had a chat in the drawing room. He said, "I want to see the light." So I brought him outside, and I turned my back on him to say, "Look, that's the light up there. You see, that's our kitchen, and that's the symbol. And it's not a candle, because we were told, no, not a candle. Candles burn the house down. So we got a lamp specially made with no off switch." And I was pointing that out to him, and I turned around, and tears were actually rolling down his cheeks. It was a very special moment, such an intense connection. And I think that probably is something that some of you in this room would feel, because we're very lucky in Ireland that there is that very strong sense of connection of those who've left Ireland. And I addressed both houses of the Irish Parliament about the Irish diaspora, and it was a new word, or diaspora. Nobody knew what I was talking about. Now, there's a huge sense of that wider Irish family. And in fact, at the moment, in an Ireland that's recovering from a financial downturn and crisis, we have the gathering, as some of you would have heard, this year in 2013. And there's a huge welcome back to Ireland because that connection has been built on over the years. Serving for those 7 years as president was an extraordinary experience. As you heard, I was the first head of state to go to Somalia. I went to Rwanda after the genocidal killing. I came to this country for a wonderful state visit with President Bill and Hillary Clinton. Went to a number of other places. And it was a very difficult decision at the end of this, coming towards the end of the 7 years, whether to go for a second term. In the way of things, if I had gone forward, I don't think anybody would have opposed me, because I was popular, I was known. It was very unlikely there would be opposition. But I knew in my heart that it would be difficult to do it with the same passion for another 7 years. Because what I had done was enlarge it. I'd gone to visit Queen Elizabeth, I'd gone to Northern Ireland, I'd shaken the hand of Gerry Adams, I'd done all those things. And I felt the office is now strong. It's well liked by people, they like the way it's done. Now's the time to step down and let somebody else be elected. And that's what happened. There was a hard-fought election, and then Senator Mary McAleese was elected. And now we have a man again, as President Michael D. Higgins. And each of them has sort of brought their own personality to a very active presidency. So I was very worried about what I would do, but just by coincidence, a few weeks later, the first High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations resigned suddenly and went back to his country, Ecuador, to become foreign minister. I didn't know then it was because the job was literally impossible, very, very difficult. When I asked the Irish government to nominate me, I did get some warning that the office was new in the UN, underfunded, low morale, but I was a human rights person, and this was something I felt would be a great honour to give leadership in the United Nations. And Kofi Annan appointed me, and I took up the job. And in the book, I do describe that the first 3 or 4 months were the hardest work of my life, because it was an office with a huge mandate and almost no resources, with very stressed human rights officers. And somehow every day brought problems. So I started getting up earlier every morning, working later in the office, taking sleeping pills. And by that first Christmas in 1997, I was almost in bits. I'm very honest about that in the book, because my daughter said to me, "I remember, Mom, I remember what you were like. You have to be truthful about it, you have to say." And that was hard in a way, because, you know, it's very personal. But it was a brother of mine, one of my older brothers, my oldest brother, a doctor, who had come back from New Zealand. And he took me aside and said, Mary, you need to pull yourself together or you're heading for breakdown territory. I said, what do you mean? You know, brother to sister and sister to brother. And I threw away the sleeping pills, took more time, took a longer period of holiday to really regroup, and went back to the office. And over the next few years, we built up a much stronger team. And I actually decided that the only way I could really fulfill the mandate of bringing home issues of human rights was to go to where the victims were. So I spent a lot of time traveling to the worst places of human rights violations, to Chechnya, where there was fighting there, and that resulted in a resolution against the Russian Federation, to East Timor, that small country, Timor-Leste, which had such terrible problems, to various parts of Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo, to others where there was, to Sierra Leone. I led a delegation to Sierra Leone. And by being able to listen and then bring these voices back, I at least forced governments to pay attention and to try to prioritize. And at the same time, I was aware that at the international level, there wasn't a sufficient balance and agreement about the words human rights. In fact, if you hear the words human rights, they don't mean the same thing to everybody. Some people, you think of amnesty and political prisoners, but I was aware there's another side of human rights which is terribly important in poor developing countries. Rights to food, and safe water, and health, and education. So that's why I spent the 8 years in New York leading Realizing Rights and working in African countries on health issues, on decent work, and in particular on peace and security, and women peace and security, going from country to country, because we were a very small organization, partnering with various partners. And that brought me to where I am now, and why I came back to Ireland, which I wanted to do anyway, and established a foundation on climate justice. Because everywhere I was going in Africa, I was hearing what I call the ah, but sentence. Ah, but things are so much worse. We don't have seasons anymore. Ah, but we've nothing but drought and then flash flooding. Ah, but in Liberia we used to have predictable rainy seasons, 2 rainy seasons. Now they don't come when they should. We're not sure how long they'll come. It's impossible to plan. It's undermining livelihoods. And that is the story all over the poorer parts of the world. It's not a story you hear when you hear the words climate change. Climate change is about glaciers and science that's contested and climate denial and arguments. Climate's about people. It's actually a huge story of justice, because the poorest and the most affected are not responsible for the fossil fuels that are warming our world. And they are devastated because they live in vulnerable climates. It's affecting them much more than in Ireland or the United States or elsewhere. Yes, you've had Sandy and you've had aggravated storms, and we'll have more and more of those. But when you live in really vulnerable climate areas, hot climate areas, even a tiny bit changes very dramatically food security. And it's a very big problem. So I'm delighted now to have a small foundation in Ireland. I'm very pleased that next month, on the 15th and 16th of April, my foundation and the Government of Ireland are co-hosting a conference during Ireland's 6-month presidency of the European Union. So it's a European Union presidency conference on hunger, nutrition, climate justice. And we will have 1/3 of the participants will be from poor developing countries, showing how they're coping, how they're becoming more climate resilient, what they're doing to try to stay where they were and be able to feed their families, because they're being undermined by the changing weather. And it's a very dramatic story. And we've combined actually with the World Resources Institute in this country, based in Washington, to try to change how we talk about climate, and to make it a movement about climate justice that reaches out to people. And I think that will keep me busy probably for the next few years. It's also helpful, and this is perhaps the last point I'll make, I say at the beginning of a chapter about the elders that my life continues to be full of surprises from time to time, because I got an invitation to join a small group that Nelson Mandela was bringing together to help to carry forward his vision. That would be chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. It would include Jimmy Carter from this country, Kofi Annan, Gro Brundtland of Norway, former minister who gave us the Brundtland Commission, Ela Bhatt from India, who founded the Self-Employed Women's Association, etc. And I was very honoured to be asked. Of course, I am one of the younger elders. I mean, please keep that in mind. But Professor Michelle, of course, married to Nelson Mandela, is also one of the elders. And we meet from time to time. We actually will have our next meeting in Dublin in May. I'm very proud to say the elders are going to come to Ireland. We look at situations of conflict, but also we've been addressing early child marriage. And that brought home to me a huge issue that I underestimated. I knew it was a big problem, but I didn't know that 10 million girls a year get married way before they're able for it. When I went with Archbishop Desmond Tutu and others to Ethiopia, to the Amhara region, we found that the average age of marriage in that region was 12. Average. So there were quite a number lower than 12. And when we went to the state of Bihar in India, it was the same thing, same average age of 12. So, and of course, that you then have pregnancy far too young, the mother dies, the child dies, the whole thing is... So there are lots of issues. I think, coming back to why write the book, what I really wanted to convey is how could I have known, growing up in the west of Ireland, a bit of a tomboy with my brothers, what life would bring. And it's brought home to me, I call the book Everybody Matters because I firmly believe that is the human rights idea. Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And here we are in the 21st century, and there are lots of people who don't have dignity and don't know they have rights. So there's work to be done. But also, I wanted it to be a story of coping also with work-life balance. I tried to say, you know, how Nick and myself with our children, etc., because I think that's important. And also, in the end, that you never achieve wherever you get to on your own. I very much stand on the shoulders of the teams of the Office of President, the Office of High Commissioner, my team in Realising Rights, my team in the Foundation, everybody who has helped me to try to achieve something. So I hope in particular that some young people, when they read it, will say, I can do that, I can go ahead, I can do more, because everybody can make a difference. That's my philosophy in life. Thank you very much indeed.
Hopefully that made the flight worth it. Mrs. Robinson has agreed to take some questions. We have microphones on both sides of the room if people would line up. But I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair and recognize one of our students, who I understand is on this side, who has a question for Mrs. Robinson. Come on.
Thank you. First of all, that was incredible. My name is Andrew Wofford. I'm a senior at the Shipley School, which is a local high school. And I'm currently working on an independent study focusing on genocide and the role of sort of international collective preventative action in bodies like the UN. And I'm actually examining the current conflict in Syria. And this is a slightly loaded question, but the current UN High Commissioner for Human Rights actually just announced that the death toll in Syria broke 70,000 people. And I guess I'm just wondering if you could speak about what you feel is sort of the role of a body like the United Nations in sort of regarding intervention and prevention of human rights violations. And also just based on your experiences, if you could talk about some sort of the limitations of an organization, like you said, that has such a huge mandate, but with really little resources for the task that it faces. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, well thank you for a thoughtful and excellent question. And it's a hard question, but I'm glad you asked it because it does need to be addressed, particularly currently in relation to Syria, as you said. Let me tell you first of all, and I say it in a joking way, but it's a way of explaining what I think about the United Nations, which I worked in for 5 years, which I actually remain supportive of. But I had the same approach that Winston Churchill had when he talked about democracy. He said democracy is the worst system, except for all the others. So, there's a little bit of that. But actually, even more than that, I think it's important to think of two different UNs. There's the humanitarian UN that's desperately trying to get into Syria and is getting in with as much as it can. There's the UNICEF that works with children. There's the ILO that has labour standards. There's the UNEP that has environmental standards. The UNDP that does development, etc., etc., etc. The High Commissioner for Human Rights, as you said. And then there's the political UN. And that's the one that causes most problems. That's the Security Council. And the Security Council has not been able to agree on Syria, particularly because Russia and China, Russia in particular, will not support the kind of measures that were being discussed. And there may be fault on both sides. On the other side, there may be too much assistance. Assad has to go. That may not have been tactically as wise, but you know, that's an issue that could be discussed. But all too often, when the Security Council fails to agree, they don't stick it to the member states. How could you as countries not agree? They say the UN has failed. And I think we have to get away a bit from that. The UN is the vehicle for countries to be more coherent about what they do, and I think that's at least part of the issue. But also, in my experience, until we have civil society in countries, including hopefully in the future, civil society in the Russian Federation saying, we do not like our government supporting a government that's killing its people. The way the people in Syria are being slaughtered, men, women and children, hiding in their own country as internally displaced or across borders. More than 1 million now are outside Syria. I know a lot about Syria in a way from the work of another elder, Lakhdar Brahimi. He's got the mandate both from the UN and from the Arab states. And you know, he is trying, I don't think he even sleeps at night. He's trying so hard to try and get agreement, and yet he can't get past that political barrier. So it's a great subject to be working on, and I would really encourage you. Thank you for a great question.
Surely we have other questions. This is never a bashful audience, really. Here we go.
Madam President, thank you for coming. I've been a fan of yours for a long time.
Thank you.
I'm Dr. Stephen Medjic, Professor of Science at Doran Family University. And again, I have been a fan of yours for many years, including your recent comment just now about the United Nations. What I did not hear today, or what we did not hear today, Madam President, is your thoughts, your reflections on internal Irish politics, including the Good Friday Agreement. Now, I realize that happened, it was signed after you had left under very accolades, I understand that, but it certainly was negotiated during your time, and the involvement of Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, Ted Kennedy. Could you please address that? Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to do it. There is quite a bit about Northern Ireland in the book itself. It was threaded its way through for obvious reasons. And I'm delighted that the Good Friday Agreement came about and is now being built on with the shared power administration in Northern Ireland. I think I have many times recognized in public the huge role played by different personalities from this country in helping that process. For example, while I was serving as president, George Mitchell was appointed by President Clinton initially as an economic advisor to give an economic dividend to people in Northern Ireland. He came and had lunch with Nick and myself in Orasan. We asked him how long he thought he'd be doing this, and he said, oh, you know, I'm going to help to organize a big conference in Belfast and bring investors over to show that if peace comes about, then people can have a better life. But he didn't know then that shortly afterwards, and before that conference was actually organized, Bill Clinton changed his terms of reference and gave him a much broader mandate, which had him for years in Northern Ireland, doing an extraordinary job in bringing about the what would contribute. Another way in which I address this very much as president, and I describe it in the book, is to link with those who were trying to make peace on the ground. And interestingly, women were very important. It was women who came out from the Catholic housing estates and the Protestant housing estates. The men wouldn't do it. The women came out and met each other and said, we can't have another generation of children destroyed by the fighting, the stoning, the kneecapping, all that going on. And also religious groups, peace groups, there were various people. And I could invite them to come to my residence in Dublin, and I could also go to Northern Ireland to meet with them. And that was why I went to Republican West Belfast, and that meant that I met the local politicians, including Gerry Adams, and it became a very controversial issue. But it was important to do it, because it brought Republican West Belfast out of the cold. They were doubly isolated. They didn't want to be part of the United Kingdom, and they weren't supported from the South in any kind of way of being in touch. So that was important. But the reason I didn't talk about current Irish politics is there is a tradition of non-executive presidents of not talking directly about issues that are in the political domain. So, but I do in the book very much describe how important it was that we got peace in Northern Ireland. Thank you.
While you're
Sorry.
gathering your
Okay,
over here.
good. Hi.
Hi, I'm Maya Rosenberg. I'm a junior at Friends Central School, and I was just wondering what kinds of struggles you faced being a female president and how you dealt with those struggles.
When I was elected and at the inauguration, my real sense was I'm the 7th President of Ireland and the first woman. I'm going to show that it's a great advantage to be a woman. I'm happy that I can have, you know, the additional ability to be innovative, to use symbols, to reach out, to do it differently from 6 men who had preceded me. And so I very much saw it that way. And then in 1996, I went to a meeting in Stockholm in Sweden where there were a number of other presidents and prime ministers, women. There weren't many of us. I think there were about 8 or 9 of us there. And we formed the Council of Women World Leaders, which is women who are currently or have been elected president or prime minister. So it was confined to that level. There are now over 40 members of the Council of Women World Leaders. And so, you know, it's not so unusual anymore. I know it hasn't happened yet in this country, but it'll happen pretty soon. I mean, I hope some of you are lining up to be good candidates. But, and I'm very interested in women's leadership. I talk about it quite a bit in the book, that actually what we have to do is do it a bit, you know, be prepared to be more innovative. Show that having women as leaders can make a difference, particularly if they open the door to women who are working in grassroots, who are maybe suffering from, you know, their livelihoods being undermined, whatever it may be, that there is a connection. And I often speak in the context of climate that women have 2 characteristics, if you like, and this isn't to undermine men in any way, but I think it's fair to say that women tend to be more intergenerational. And in thinking about climate and people, we have to be intergenerational, because we're using up a carbon budget that's going to make it so much more difficult for my grandchildren. My 4 grandchildren, the eldest is 9, they'll be in their 40s in 2050. And those of you who read about climate know that we may be in a very, very distressed world at that stage, a world of 9 billion people. So that intergenerational thinking is what we need. And then women are also more practical. So I never really felt it's going to be more difficult for me as a woman. I felt it's an advantage that I do this as the first woman, and I'm going to do it all the better for that. So, okay.
My name is Conrad Ogletree. I'm not in high school. But it seems as I was listening to you speak that you represent a progression of thinking through your political career. And it feels like here in the States that we're sort of stuck. So you broke that ceiling or that something, not as a woman, but just as a culture. And I wonder if you have any insights on how we might be able to break out of our old to the new. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but it's not an easy question to answer. I mean, certainly, even as I was writing the book, I was conscious of what you were saying, that it's as though I was you know, preparing for where I am now. I suppose maybe we all do that, but I feel that what I have learned helps me now, because I'm linking human rights, development and climate. I'm talking about climate justice, like I was talking about the diaspora, and nobody understood, you know, was particularly thinking about that word. And I am hoping that in a year or 2, far, far more people will talk about climate justice and climate affecting people. So I feel, you know, the confidence of that. And what I feel as somebody who was lucky enough to be educated in this country when I went to the Harvard Law School and lived in this country for 8 years and enjoyed New York. I hope it's not a problem for Philadelphia. I say New York's a great city, and I enjoyed it thoroughly, enjoyed working from there. But I do worry about just how kind of dysfunctional, especially your Congress has become. I mean, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. And that's worrying, not just for the United States immediately, it's worrying for concepts of democracy in the world. Because after all, the United States has been more or less the champion and leader on democratic government. And now, you know, I'm hearing the Chinese and others say, you know, well, if that's democracy, you can keep it. They can't even function. You know, so it's quite worrying actually, and I hope that this is just a bad time and that things will move along. And I think, I think pressure from civil society, I always feel, is one of the best ways to get governments to be more accountable. I mean, that's the human rights way.
This will be our last question.
Thank you very much. I appreciated your remarks. Happy International Women's Day.
Thank you.
My name is Marie Chevrier. I'm a professor at Rutgers University in Camden. And I very much appreciate your connection of human rights, human security, and climate change. And this past week, the government of Norway just hosted, as I'm sure you know, the humanitarian aspect of nuclear weapons. And if you would maybe make a few remarks, both on the high end of weapons and the low end, because both nuclear weapons and small arms and their role in human rights. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the question. I was honorary president of Oxfam from 1998 until the end of last year, and Oxfam and Amnesty, as you know, were very keen and are very keen on an arms trade agreement, so that there is an international framework for that. Also, the elders have been supportive of the need for more progress on the nuclear issue, on reducing nuclear armaments, and they're kind of two hats that I wear. And like many people, particularly from Europe, we are following closely, and with that kind of surprised concern, the issue of small arms in this country, the right to, when some of them are not so small, and we just don't understand it. It's not something that we can culturally relate to, but we know that the feelings are very strong, so I think my real answer, my honest answer is this is something that I have. I've been thinking about in various capacities, but not actually as much as I've been thinking about lots of other issues. So I'm not a great expert on this area, although I do, like you, agree that it is extraordinarily important. It's terribly important to reduce small arms, so-called, these Kalashnikov rifles and that in the world, because I've seen in the arms of child soldiers, I've seen in so many different ways the havoc. That's what's happening now in Syria. There's so many arms around and so many militias that it's going to be very, very hard to bring Syria back into a more cohesive and hopefully peaceful situation, because and it's that availability of arms. So I think we need, just as a human race, to think, weapons of destruction are not going to be helpful to our future in broad terms. But that's not an expert answer, that's just a more general one. And happy International Women's Day to you as well, to all of you. Thank you very much.
I want to thank once again, and we're going to make a small presentation to Mrs. Robinson. I want to ask Congressman Mike Fitzpatrick to come up and join us. Mike serves the 8th Congressional District of Pennsylvania. And we have Ishal Robinson, a student from the Bodine High School of International Affairs. And they will make a special presentation to Mrs. Robinson.
Thank you, Craig. Mrs. Robinson, Ireland's president with a purpose. I want to, on behalf of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia and all the invited guests, thank you for joining us today and sharing some of the experiences that have shaped and sustained your vision for a peaceful and sustainable world. You certainly inspired us with the example that you've set over the years, both as a passionate and compassionate leader and advocate for global human rights. Your work to encourage democratic governance and intergenerational dialogue particularly resonates with the Council, whose education programs have helped to build a growing core of leaders, hopefully like yourself, possessing the critical skills necessary to assume the responsibilities of global leadership. And attending events like today's, where they can hear and meet with prominent individuals like yourself, serves to enrich their experiences and offer credibility to the choices that leaders make in dealing with crucial global challenges. As you heard, with me is Ishal Robinson, who's a sophomore at Bodine High School for International Affairs. And she has a sweatshirt from Bodine to give to you as a small token of everybody's appreciation. So thank you again, Mrs. Robinson, for speaking to us and and sharing with us today.
We are formally adjourned for the luncheon portion of our program. As I said at the outset, Mrs. Robinson agreed to remain with us to have a